Anyway, so I was asked to share a personal story of who I am and how I arrived in Appalachia and what's led me to stay. So I've been here living and working in Appalachian, Ohio for 44 years. I came here when I was almost 30. So I'm an older guy. I grew up in the inner city of Cleveland, Ohio. I was the second oldest of 12 kids. My mom had 12 kids in 13 years in the inner city. That's a whole nother challenge like Appalachia. Anyway, that was in the 1950s and early 60s. I have 7 sisters named Mary. We call them by their middle names or some other name we can come up with. My dad's work took us to Columbus, where I went to high school. And from there I ended up working on you can't hear me? From there I ended up working on an iron ore tanker up on the Great Lakes. Yeah, I was sailing from Silver Bay, Minnesota to Toledo, Ohio on carrying taconite, a chemically treated iron ore from to the Armco steel mills in Middletown, Ohio, and I sailed on the SS Middletown, the largest ship on the Great Lakes at the time. It was, and the flagship of the fleet, we passed, I don't know, 4 or 5 times a week, passing each other on the lakes or the rivers. And that was known as the SS Edmund Fitzgerald. Anybody ever heard of that little craft? Well, it was the last of the Great Lakes shipwrecks. Forget how many went down with it, 60 people or so on the bottom of Lake Superior. But we used to see them wave. The captains used to salute each other with their foghorns. It was a long 2 shorts and a long, and you knew one of those other sister ships was going by. Anyway, that one, they're all gone now. I followed my ship up until about a year ago. It had gotten sold and it was dry docked in Duluth, Minnesota for, a decade or so, but I noticed that it got bought and it was towed across the Great Lakes and out the St. Lawrence Seaway and over to Turkey where it was cut up and scrapped. So there's a whole rich history of maritime history that helped build the United States that's been scrapped. We're kind of our throwaway society. While I was on the Great Lakes, having dropped out of school, I discovered that I had won the lottery. And that was the United States Draft Lottery. And I had number 1. Haven't bought a lottery ticket since. Who's gonna do that again? So within a few months, found myself in boot camp, and wasn't long after I had the fortune of being sent to South Korea instead of South Vietnam during the height of that conflict. I thank my lucky stars every day still. When I returned from the service, I joined a survey crew for the Ohio Department of Natural Resources. Had the opportunity to see many parts of Ohio and learn some things about some of the people and the places that make up the stories of this great state. It's pretty amazing. After that, I went with a couple of high school buddies and we hitchhiked around Western Europe for 4 months, camping out beneath the crowned heads of Europe. That was different. I learned the geography of Europe by crossing borders, because I went over there. I dropped out of college and out of school, so I learned on foot what that looked like. When I got home, I finally thought maybe I should go to school, and I used the GI Bill and studied some natural resources and wildlife management at OSU in Columbus. And while I was there, many of the places and buildings and cool places that I was discovering about Columbus were changing. Cool old buildings were being demolished. Interesting wild places that had survived till I found them were being developed. And so when I graduated, I felt like I needed to head out of Dodge. And I went to Athens looking for a job. While there, I stopped into the university to check it out and discovered a beautiful campus. I checked in on the graduate programs before I got out of there. After a brief conversation with a geography professor, I managed to score a tuition waiver and enrolled in the Ohio Geography and the Environmental Planning and Design program down there. And my sister's parents-in-law had a tiny little cabin about the size of 2 sets of these tables, maybe less, 100 yards off the woods, or 100 yards off the road out in the woods, 10, 12 miles from Athens. And I lived in that for a year with no water, no electric. And I, right off the bat, got the biggest education of my life. Things that we take for granted every day. We don't think about where they come from or how far you gotta go to get them. So I lived there free for a year. Found it challenging. I was going to school and had a job bartending, kept me out late at night. So it was a little tough going home and, you know, at night in that little cabin. Sometimes it snowed, you had to walk all the way back 100 yards to get into the woods if I was carrying anything. And then when I got there, I had to start a fire. And there was a bunk, a wood stove, and a table, and a few shelves to put some stuff on. Little Franklin wood stove. And I didn't know the difference between one type of wood in the forest and as another as far as firewood quality. Amazing how many nights I started a fire and it was already burned it all up before I fell asleep. I'd get up in the morning and there'd be a half a cup of coffee frozen on the table. This is interesting. I'm glad I did it. And, but, you know, I didn't want to do that forever, so I moved into the Athens Asylum. Anybody know about the Athens Asylum? Yeah. Everybody's heard of it, right? Yeah. It's famous around the country because it's haunted and because there's a stain, which reinforces the haunted business. But basically, none of that's true, but the stories, the true stories are amazing. So I lived there for a year. They had a resident volunteer program. And if you put in 15 hours a week with the clients, you got free room and board. That fit my budget very well. I heard Patty Mitchell's name was mentioned earlier by somebody with Passion Works. You familiar with her? She's a rock star. She lived at the Athens Asylum roughly around the time I did. So I tell people, yeah, Patty and I lived together at the Athens Asylum back in the day. Anyway, she's amazing. She's changing the world all by herself with all the people she gets to help her, of course. Let's see, and I volunteered there for 12 more years till they closed it down. So it had a big influence on my life. I had never been exposed to issues of mental illness. Not that anybody said was that mental illness. I saw a lot of craziness in my life, but nobody ever said anything about mental illness. So anyway, I got an exposure to that while I was there. And it's been valuable ever since. And probably living in that old pad like that up in the asylum got me interested in, even more interested in historic buildings. And while down there, all my free time I'd spend hiking in the forest and exploring southeast Ohio, visiting all these cool small towns in southeast Ohio. It was a never-ending joy to discover so many things like parks and nature preserves, but also abandoned strip mine land, old iron furnaces, remnants of old canals, brick kilns, cool towns in Perry County, so many cool towns in Perry County, Native American earthworks, abandoned railroad trestles, grindstone quarries, county courthouses, opera houses, train depots, coal tipples. Much of that stuff is gone today. It was here not long ago. And that's what made me want to stay, because I didn't grow up around any of that stuff, and I wanted to see and learn more about it. I found the greatest education available to me was off campus and out of town. And you could learn about all the cultures that settled southeast Ohio. You could learn about poverty. You could learn about architecture. You could learn so much stuff. I soon landed a job at the Athens City County Health Department running the litter control and recycling program down there, where I really, really began to meet people. When they throw their stuff out on the road, you got to knock on their door. And they oftentimes left their mail in their trash, so you knew right where to go. Anyway, and I spent a lot of time organizing cleanups of roadways and streams and really large illegal dump site cleanups. And I had to use a lot of volunteers, probably 10,000 of them over the 20 years I did that. And you know, when you're picking up trash with other people, they kind of learn to trust you almost immediately. You're safe, you know? And so I'm amazed how much stuff I learned while we were having fun rolling appliances up the hill and getting them onto the back of a truck, and the stories I would hear. And I learned a lot about Athens County and the people of Athens County. And I worked with other adjacent counties. In Athens in the spring of 1984, I worked with I don't know how many volunteers to put together the first comprehensive curbside recycling program in the state of Ohio. We were the first ones to pick up bottles, cans, newspapers, cardboard, magazines, all that stuff at the curb. And this past April was the 40th anniversary of that. And it's sad to see it's in decline. It was a community organized program, but it was the most recent decisions were made by a couple of elected officials and, you know, government officials. So it was built by the community and, I don't know, changed by a couple individuals. Not for the good, in my opinion. Anyway, I think we're going to have to start over on some of that business. A lot of people think because there's blue containers out there in the world that recycling's being taken care of. And let me tell you, it's not. The waste stream is rising. It's at flood stage, and it's continuing to rise. I don't care how much we recycle. We're not catching up with it hardly at all. At least it's on our radar, but we're missing the opportunities. Let's see, I was involved with the Citizens of Athens. Well, I mentioned that. Let's see. And then, somewhere that same year of 1984, I stumbled into a job teaching observational astronomy in the evenings at Ohio University. Something I learned when I was hitchhiking around Europe with a buddy of mine. He taught me a lot about the stars. I got addicted to it. Next thing you know, there was an opportunity to teach it. This is my 40th year doing that. I lost my job in recycling after a quarter century, and then started doing some landscaping with a group of folks. Amazing stuff. We built a lot of good heritage worth preserving. We used a lot of natural stone and planted a lot of native species, and it was a delight to do that. And then I started working at the Southeast Ohio History Center. Been there almost 10 years now. And I was asked to share some stories about Appalachian Ohioans who have built community in the region and how we see their legacy of community building through today. Well, picking up trash with a lot of people, there's a lot of stories, but I thought I'd mention one of them. You know, it's interesting, all the different volunteers I work with. I ran into one in the grocery store the other day I hadn't seen in decades. But it took a double take to see it was that person, but it was. It was good to see him. Anyway, or her. Anyway, and I'll say this too, you could never afford to pay for the work you get out of volunteers, because they do it because they want to do it. They're not doing it for the paycheck. And so you guys all know this, you're working with volunteers yourselves, but just think of the value that they offer. But I thought I'd share a few stories with some folks I worked ago in Gloucester, Ohio. How many of you know where Gloucester, Ohio is? Not enough of us. I remember when I first saw Gloucester driving down the main street, all these false fronts on these buildings. It reminded me of an old West town I'd seen in the movies. Anyway, I then found myself working with folks there. It was a former boom town during the mining area of Ohio's history, but it's been a center of poverty and decline for over a half century, maybe longer. And in my appearance, it also has been the center of community spirit and resilience. You know, because we generate so much waste in the modern world, our human nature often prevents us from doing the right thing with our ever-growing waste stream. As individuals and as institutions and communities, we're not always doing the right thing, and you know this. All communities struggle with it. Poorer communities may have a greater challenge. When money's hard to come by, the last thing you want to spend it on is getting rid of something you don't want anymore. And so people would tend to dump their trash out on a county road where nobody lived, or over a hill, or into the creek. And the more poverty you had, the more misplaced waste there was. And so I worked with a lot of volunteers to clean these sites up. And I started working with a woman named Sadie Parks in Gloucester, Ohio. Sadie, she's a woman, she was in her 70s, but she'd already raised her family, and probably in the subsequent 20 years, another 10 or 15 kids from the community of Gloucester who needed some parental guidance. It was amazing. And anyway, she found herself on village council in her late 70s, mid to late 70s, and she wanted to get things done. And so I was working with her. We embarked on this big cleanup right on the border between Trimble and Gloucester, where Sunday Creek used to run, but when they channelized the creek, the water went that way and it left a big ditch, which I'm not sure who it was, but they thought they should put some car frames and a few other things in there to stabilize it, I guess. There's always an excuse for doing that kind of thing. Anyway, that attracted some appliances, and then it attracted some of this and that and the other thing. And finally, it was a massive dump site, almost like a landfill between the two communities. So we started cleaning it up one Saturday. And we got the villages of Gloucester, Trimble, and Jacksonville all to help. Lots of people, township trustees, wood that we pulled out of there. We had the fire department out there burning it, and they had their hose keeping it under control. And I remember on about the third Saturday, old Sadie standing there with her hands on her hips, and she goes, "Well, Tom, what are we going to do with this site once it's cleaned up?" I said, "Well, Sadie, it looks like it's close to your park. Why don't you just extend the park down there?" And she said, "Yep, we'll do it." I loved her attitude because she just made that. She didn't run it by anybody, but that's what she's going to do. And then a few moments later, she said, "Well, this is a memorial park." And just trying to be supportive, I said, "Well, let's build a memorial." And she goes, "Well, them boys from Vietnam never had a memorial." I said, "Let's build them one." I was just being supportive. She said, "We're going to do it, and I'm putting you on the committee." So that was in May. And she sure enough put me on a committee, and we had meetings, and we did, she hooked me up with a group of other elderly women at the Gloucester Depot. They were called the Gloucester Project. And their theme was like that of the little red hen. Well, if nobody else is going to help us do it, we're going to do it ourselves. And these gals fixed up the historic train depot in town, and they had all kinds of fundraisers, auctions, ice cream socials, you name it. Plus, they made all this stuff. They had quilting bees in there on a couple days a week making big, beautiful quilts out of old rags and thrown away materials. They made rag rugs out of thrown away stuff. Here I was trying to talk about recycling, and they were telling me how recycling works. They've been recycling their whole lives. And so Sadie hooked me in with that group, and we started raising money for this monument, and by November, by Veterans Day of that year, the town of Gloucester put up the first Korea-Vietnam memorial in the southeast quadrant of the state of Ohio, and they're one of the poorest communities in the state. And they raised that money in short order. They had a walk-a-thon walking from Gloucester to Chansey. They did it. They were amazing. And then the Gloucester Depot women started sponsoring quarterly recycling drives right at the depot. People could bring their bottles, cans, and newspapers. And as the years went on, they were bringing appliances and furniture and things that we could help them get rid of properly. The amount of money they raised was amazing. Not only did they save the depot, but they helped redo the city village building. They did so, and they fed all their volunteers every time. And they didn't just feed them hot dogs, they fed them chicken dinners with real mashed potatoes and homemade noodles. And you could see them making it while they're out there in front doing this work. It was pretty amazing. They made all kinds of products that they sold for income made out of recycled materials. I mentioned the quilts and the rag rugs, but they had these really cool door stops. Started with a brick, and they wrapped it with a bunch of different materials and foam or something, and then had a shape of a chicken, like the little red hen, used it for a doorstop. And they changed that town. It was amazing. And then there was an old clock a street clock standing on a pole in front of the depot. It had been moved from Athens to Gloucester sometime after World War II. And I remember when I first saw it, it was rusty. It hadn't worked in 30 years, and there was a 30-06 bullet hole through it. I remember talking to one of the county commissioners, and I heard him say, "Yeah, I was there the day that fellow shot that." He gave me the name. I don't remember it. Probably best to protect the guilty. Anyhow, there was one day we did a recycling drive there, and I said to Ida May was the other person who was so outstanding with the Gloucester Depot group. She was also one of 12 kids, and she and her sister were kind of the leaders of this organization. I mentioned to Ida May one day. I said, "Ida, we ought to recycle that clock and get it running again one of these days." She said, "We'll do it," and they did. And they found an old Maytag washing machine motor that made it run and keep time perfectly for about a decade or so, and then, I don't know, 30 years later, it wasn't keeping time anymore. And so I called somebody up there, and they did another fundraiser and they fixed it again in 2013. But these people were amazing. Virginia Moore, Tiny McSweeney, she was the one who kept the books and she made sure people did everything a certain way. She was the smallest person there, but boy, she could crack a whip. Henry Schaefer and his wife. And his wife, she's the one that told me how when they made moonshine back in the 30s, how you colored it that whiskey color. She said, you know how they did that? I said, no. She said, you burn some corn in a frying pan and you swirl that around in the bathtub and then you filter it out. It leaves it a sort of a nice caramely color. How would I have known that otherwise? Anyway, June Bigman, Sandra Vaughn, Farley Brunton, what an amazing township trustee. The mayor, I had the mayor down in the middle of this dump site prying out metal that was buried in the mud. It was amazing to see that kind of stuff. Dave Brown, Mary Exline, Della Lowry. I think most of them are all long past now. I remember for the 20th anniversary of Earth Day back in 1990, we had a big event at the fairgrounds and lots of groups and organizations brought tables that they set up to educate the public. And of course, the Gloucester ladies, they came too and they had their booth. And it's at that point that I was able to introduce Ida Mae Stoneburner to my mom and dad, who came down to see what the hell their boys were up to down there in Athens. And so I introduced them, and Ida Mae said to my mom, well, you're his mom when he's in Columbus. I'm his mom down here in Athens County. And my dad said, and God help you. So Ida Mae worked also with some of her fellow citizens to rehabilitate an old church up in Oakdale along Sunday Creek. Had seen a lot of years of neglect and abandonment. And when they got it redone, Ida Mae invited me to come up to the dedication. And I couldn't say no to Ida Mae, even though it was a Sunday afternoon. I probably had a lot of other things I wanted to do, but Ida Mae is one of those people. So I went, and then she introduced me to everybody there, and I wasn't prepared for that. And she told everybody there that I may have been from Columbus, but as far as she was concerned, I was an honorary citizen of Trimble Township. And I have to say, I don't know what you guys have all heard about Trimble Township, but it has somewhat of a bad reputation for many years down in Athens County, because of the bars and the mining history and all that, and poverty. And I never felt so humbled and honored in my life as when she said that, and I certainly wasn't expecting that. So it's people like that that gave me a chance. I remember going to Ida Mae's 80th birthday party and all of her siblings and her kids. Amazing. And then there's Sam Jones. How many of you ever heard of Sam Jones? Sam Jones grew up in Trimble Township, and he's got the oldest gym in America. His grandpa started it in 1936 right there on the main street, and he's been taking kids in off the streets in the evenings and teaching them boxing and giving them an opportunity to do something other than look for trouble. And Sam has created Golden Gloves champions throughout his career. But the main thing he does is he makes kids champions in life first. And his entire gym, it looks like a gym you've seen in a movie, in a 1930s movie or something like that. It's amazing. And the walls are covered not only with all the boxers you've ever heard of, who Sam has met all of them, and introduced his kids to all of them, but he's got also pictures of Gloucester and all the coal mines of the region, and he takes people around and tells them about every picture. So you get an education while you're learning to box and to be a good citizen. And then Sam, some 40-some years ago, he started a program called Boxing for Books. And he puts boxing gloves on little kids, girls and boys, whatever, and they get out there and spar for just a few moments. The minute anybody looks dazed or sees the first drop of blood, the towel goes in, both arms go up. You got nothing but winners in those games. And he's raised over $750,000 for books for the Trimble Township School District. Amazing. He's 84 years old, and he can still kick me in the chest. And I go back about 4 feet. Amazing guy. I work with another group called Ohio's Hill Country Heritage Area. It's an all-volunteer group that's promoting, the protection of our heritage of the Appalachian region of Ohio. And we have an annual Appalachian Heritage Awards luncheon at the State House every year. We've been doing this about 12 years, and some number of years ago we created the Sam Jones Model Citizen Award, and we gave it to him, and then each year we make him come back up and we find somebody else whose body of work rises to that occasion, that level, and so we give the Sam Jones Award out each year. If you haven't been to the Ohio State House for the Appalachian Heritage Awards luncheon, something to go to. We should get it so big that the people in the State House, and the reason we went up there is we wanted to let the state legislature know all this amazing stuff that people are doing down there in Appalachian, Ohio to preserve their heritage. And they're not doing it with state funding, they're doing it with blood, sweat, and tears, and many of them have been at it for decades. And so we celebrate them and try to get on the radar of the state legislature so they can start figuring out how to help. You know, Appalachian Ohio is where Ohio began. It started in Marietta, and it drifted. The first governors all came out of Southeast Ohio. Matter of fact, they had the state capitol here in Zanesville and in Chillicothe twice before they figured out where they were going to build Columbus, and they don't know that. So we want to remind them. The territorial capital was in Marietta, and this is where the leadership came to get Ohio on the map, and we need some help in Appalachia from our leadership. Around 1990, I got involved with a group in Gallipolis. Their community felt threatened by the construction of a medical waste incinerator along the Ohio River down their way. And so I began working with a group of volunteers that include Fran McEwen and Bobby Holzer. Holzer Clinic is part of her family. She was a leader. She jumped in. Even though she didn't need to, she could have got other people to do it. She did it. Then I have to mention this fellow named Dr. Hubertus Wilhelm. Anybody know the Wilhelms? Dr. Hubert Wilhelm. I'll tell you his story, a little bit about his story. He was born in Germany. And when World War II started, he was a young lad in school. And he was forced into becoming a Hitler Youth. You know, and they had to march and do whatever they did. But when the war was over, he made his way to America. And he finished high school in Illinois. And he met a gal there who eventually, after he had to go back, he made his way back and he married her. And then he studied geography. And he graduated from LSU and he came to Ohio University, I don't know, in the early 60s to teach Ohio geography and cultural geography. And this guy, he went to every courthouse in the state of Ohio and got out the 1850 census. And he tallied up every township in Ohio and every county, because in 1850 census, that's the first time they asked people, where were you born? And he listed all the people who were in Ohio in each county that were from Maine and New Hampshire and Vermont and Washington and New York and Pennsylvania and Maryland and every single place all down through the South. And all the ones who were born in England and France and Switzerland and Germany and Italy, tallied them all up. He was the first guy to teach us who we as Ohioans really are. Who were these people who came to Ohio in a native wilderness and they carved out the landscapes that we still see the remnants of it today? You can still see these people's cultural baggage is what Hubert called it. Cultural baggage, what's that? That's their architecture and their land use. Some of them were grain farmers with cattle, some were sheep farmers, some did something else. But you can see, once you take his classes and learn from him, you can drive down the road and you can say, well, that farm was settled by people of German descent. These were New Englanders. Those were people up out of the South. He taught us about the towns, the little towns and the town squares and the neighborhood houses and the place names, you know, because they all reflect who these people were and where they came from. There are no new names in Ohio, hardly at all. I mean, we got Paris in Ohio and Rome and all kinds of places like that, but they all tell us something about where these people came from. And Hubert did that. And when he died about 10 years ago, he still had his German accent. It was amazing what he's taught us. And we're all the richer for him. He studied the natural landscape and how these settlers' relationship to the landscape left it what it is today. And I'm telling you, every ride down the street for me since then it's an educational experience. No matter what part of the state I'm in, I can see something at 50 miles an hour that tells me about who these people were. But there's so much history here. It starts way back with the earthworks. There's more Native American earthworks in the southeast quadrant of Ohio and in Appalachian Ohio. You know, they are world wonders. They are World Heritage Sites finally. They've always been a World Heritage Site, right? They just got designated that. And that's significant. And we know so little about these people who did this. All we can tell is what we see and try to describe that. It's rich stuff. This particular year right now is the 750th anniversary of an event called Lord Dunmore's War. And there were a lot of facets to that war, and it was about the people along the east. They came in here and they had conflict with Native Americans because they were interested in developing the land around here. And there was a fella named Logan. You guys all familiar with the town of Logan? Well, named after Chief Logan. And his family had been massacred in the spring of 1774. So he retaliated and he crossed the river and burned cabins and killed people. Well, that's not good for real estate development as far as Lord Dunmore and George Washington and some of these folks in the East were concerned. So Dunmore decided he was a Scottish earl and he was considered governor of Virginia, and he came here to put down this uprising. Meanwhile, he's had two armies. He led one down the Ohio River, and he was supposed to meet up with the other army that was coming down the New River in the Kanawha to meet at Point Pleasant across from Gallipolis. For whatever reason, nobody knows for sure, he decided to stop at the Hocking River, build a little fort, stash some canoes, and leave some supplies, and march 1,500 people up the Hocking River. Almost nobody along the Hocking River is aware of this story, that an army of armed people carrying guns marched right through Stewart and Guysville and Athens and Chansey and Nelsonville and Logan, and they got up to Clear Creek, cut over into the Sauda Valley. Meanwhile, the Shawnee decided to attack the other wing of the army down at Point Pleasant. Day-long battle. Tecumseh, everybody's heard Tecumseh. His dad died there. His brother fought there. It was led, the Native Americans were led by a fellow named Chief Cornstalk. They didn't want to fight. They were just trying to protect their territory. And his sister, warrior chief and peacemaker Nonalema. It's an amazing story. And when Dunmore finally met with these folks up in what's Pickaway County today, they had a treaty. Logan refused to go to it, and he gave a grand speech, very short, underneath the boughs of a spreading elm tree. It's known as Logan's Lament. It is said that at one point in American history, every school child committed that speech to memory. It's just a long paragraph, not even a long one. How many of you guys have ever heard of it? It's amazing. When it got back east, Thomas Jefferson took that and he printed it up in the only book he ever wrote, called Notes on Virginia, and he included Logan's speech. And this is at a time in American history when folks referred to Native Americans as savages, a subhuman status. And Jefferson compared Logan's speech to the oratory of Cicero and Demosthenes, comparing it to the greatest orators of the Western world. That's different. And so I remember hearing about it when I was a kid, but I certainly wasn't one of the ones that committed it to memory. But I believe that was back in the era of one-room schoolhouses. The deal there was whatever you learned in first grade, when you were in second grade, you had to help teach the first graders, right? And when you were in third grade, you had to help teach the second and the first. By the time you graduated from eighth grade, you could be the teacher. And that happened repeatedly across the landscape. Anyway, so all this event occurred with the Battle of Point Pleasant and the treaty at Camp Charlotte over in Pickaway County today, the great speech of Logan beneath the boughs of that elm tree. And then when this army got back down to the confluence of the Hocking and the Ohio, and I might mention some of the people who were in Dunmore's army at the time, unheard of at the time, but they were Ebenezer Zane of Zanesville and Zane's Trace fame, Daniel Morgan, Morgan County is named for him. George Rogers Clark, Clark County is named for him. Colonel Crawford, Crawford County is named for him. Nobody had ever heard of these folks at the time, but they were with them. And when they got back down to what's Hockingport today, remember this is just a confluence of two streams in a wild wilderness. These guys were feeling their oats because they survived battle with Native Americans. They've been living off the land and sleeping under the stars for a couple of months. And people were already complaining back east about you know, taxation without representation and such things like that. And so they passed a couple of resolutions. They're called the Fort Gower Resolves. And one of them, and I wish I had it here, I could read it to you, but basically these guys swore, you have to remember, we were all still colonies, and Ohio was the Northwest Territory. It wasn't a state or anything yet, 1774. And so these guys, they swore allegiance to the king. They would defend the king against any insult or injury, et cetera, as long as he chose to rule over a brave and free people. But, they said, there's this big but in there, but if he did choose to rule otherwise, they would defend the colonies against the king. That was on November 5th, 1774. It was printed in the Virginia Gazette on December 10th, 1775. Thomas Jefferson would have picked it up like the Zanesville Times or the Logan Daily News or the Athens Messenger, and he would have read this. And it would have been part of his thinking over the next 18 months. There are scholars who will argue that the Fort Gower Resolves was America's first Declaration of Independence. Started down here in southeastern part of what's Ohio today. How many of us know this? And we should know it. So, we had a guy come here from Virginia. He grew up in England and for his life, and then he came to Ohio in 1970, and he taught chemistry for a career at Blacksburg, Virginia. And when he retired, he started doing Virginia history, and he found out about this story, and he's on his way to the Ohio History Connection to give a talk on it. He stopped in Athens County, and he told us about it. And he said, Tom, this is important. Not only should every kid in Athens County know this story, every kid in America should know it, because this is American, this is world history. It influenced that desire for independence globally. He said, November 5th, back in England, that's our big day. That's our 4th of July. That's when we have fireworks and bonfires. Remember the 5th of November. He said, that doesn't hold a candle to what happened on the banks of the Hocking River on November 5th, 1774. He says, and remember, I'm British. We were the bad guys. So he made that clear to me, and I'm doing what I can to get that out there. This is the 250th anniversary. It led to the Declaration. It led to the American Revolution. It was one of the things. I'm not claiming it's the main thing, but the stories associated with that in southeast Ohio. We had the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. That's what brought Manasseh Cutler and that group of guys who cut a deal. They made a plan in the Bunch of Grapes Tavern in Boston, and they created the Ohio Company. And they came here and they bought land, and they started this new society. And David McCullough, the great author, he had to give a speech at Ohio University one day, and he thought, I better do some research on this, find out what Ohio University is all about. And he found that it was founded by this guy, Manasseh Cutler, and this is a guy, David McCullough, has written all these books on American history, about the American Revolution, about John Adams and all these people, and he said, I never heard of the Northwest Ordinance, the Ordinance of 1787, and one of the things it calls for, they're starting a new society in a wilderness, and one of the main precepts is that there will be no slavery. And this caught him really close. He said, lots of places have abolished slavery, but no place ever started out of the gate prohibiting it. That was pronounced. And he was coming over here to create the American Western University, and that became Ohio University. It's in this part of the state, the Appalachian region of Ohio, where the township and range survey system began. It never happened anywhere east of the Ohio border. Everybody's got that west of here. It started here. Ephraim Cutler, that's the son of Manasseh Cutler. He was a member of the founding of the Ohio Constitution, and that passed by one vote. Only one vote did the Ohio Constitution prohibit slavery. They were building ships along the Ohio River. This is kind of a little hard for me to imagine when I found out about it. Marietta and Little Hocking and some of these places, they were cutting down these primeval forest trees and turning them into ships that sailed around the world. They went to Liverpool, England, and Ceylon, and Japan, and they sailed around the Cape of Good Hope in Africa and Cape Horn in South America, built on the banks of the Ohio River. Who'd have thunk? Thomas Ewing, guy raised in Amesville, Ohio. He had to head out of Amesville and go over to the Virginia salt fields and boil salt to earn a living to go to Ohio University. And he was the first graduate ever of Ohio University. He also, when he was living in Amesville with down the road from Ephraim Cutler, they organized this thing to trap animals and collect hides and take them back east and trade them for books. And they formed the Coonskin Library, the third library in Ohio's history. Third, the first one was in Belpre, down at Farmer's Castle. Think of how much leadership came out of this part of the state of Ohio. It's phenomenal. Thomas Ewing then, after he graduated, went to Lancaster and became an attorney, became a United States Senator, Secretary of the Treasury, the first ever Secretary of the Interior. He was nominated to be Secretary of War during the Civil War under Andrew Johnson. He raised 3 boys who all became generals in the Civil War, and he took on a neighbor boy who'd been orphaned from a large family, raised him up, and that fellow also was a general in the American Civil War named William Tecumseh Sherman, raised in Lancaster as an orphan. Amazing. The contribution of Southeast Ohio to the winning of the Civil War from Appalachian Ohio. Ulysses Grant from Point Pleasant on the Ohio side of the river. William Tecumseh Sherman from Fairfield County. Philip Sheridan from Perry County. Edwin Stanton from the Steubenville area, who was Lincoln's Secretary of War. They quarried the iron in Jackson County that was used to help make the railroads and armaments and the iron cladding for the Monitor. You guys remember the story of the Monitor and the Merrimack, the battle of the first ironclads at sea? Came out of Jackson County. A fellow named Milton Holland, born to slavery in Texas to a white father. He shipped 3 of his sons to Albany, Ohio, where there was a school to teach some higher learning and manual arts to black students. So this guy from Texas sent his boys there. When the Civil War broke out, they all tried to enlist, but they weren't allowed because they were black. Well, when they finally passed the Emancipation Proclamation, Milton Holland, he enlisted. He organized a regiment of black folks, and when they went to war, they were at the Battle of Newmarket Heights. And when all the white officers were killed and put out of commission, that left him in charge, and they won that, and he got the Congressional Medal of Honor. Educated in Athens County. How many of you have heard of Januarius Aloysius Magehan? Everybody in Bulgaria knows this guy. He's known as the liberator of Bulgaria. He was too young for the Civil War, so he went overseas after the war, and at the recommendation of Philip Sheridan up there in Perry County. He was born up on Pigeon Roost outside of New Lexington. And so he goes over there to become a war correspondent. He follows battles around and reports on these things to the papers. Well, and at that time in history, England and America and Russia were all kind of getting along. They were the superpowers of the era. But some of them supported different folks, and the Russians were allies to the Turks. And the Turks had moved on down into Bulgaria, and they were going down into Bulgaria and massacring everybody they came across. They were going through towns and killing every man, woman, and child. When Januarius Aloysius Magehan got there, he saw dogs gnawing on body parts, dragging dead babies down the street. And how could he stop it? Well, he wrote articles to the New York Times and the London Times, and they brought the powers that be down on the Russians so that the Russians had to step in and stop the Turks. They have parks and streets named after Januarius Aloysius Magehan in Bulgaria. He's from our backyard, liberator of Bulgaria. Every June they have a contingent of ambassadors come to the graveyard in New Lexington and start at sunrise with a wreath-laying ceremony and an educational program. But it gets past most of it. He's the classic example of the pen being mightier than the sword. He was not a violent guy, but he stopped the massacre of the Turks. Frances Dana Barker Gage, woman in McConnellsville, who was so much of an outstanding leader in abolition. A fellow named James Edwin Campbell went to a tiny little wooden school down in Pomeroy. He was the first black to write poetry in a black dialect. We mostly hear about that from Paul Lawrence Dunbar, a friend of the Wright brothers, but this guy did it earlier, but we hadn't discovered it yet. He also became the first president of West Virginia State University. Moses Fleetwood Walker, anybody heard of this guy? Yeah, he was the first black man to play professional baseball in American history, probably 50 to 60 years before Jackie Robinson. He played for the Toledo Blue Stockings. So a lot of stuff came out of Southeast Ohio. Emma Gatewood, you guys all know who Emma Gatewood is? She walked the Appalachian Trail after age 67 a couple of 2-3 times. She did the Pacific Crest Trail. What an inspiring woman she is. Howard Chandler Christie, anybody know about that guy? He was an artist, came out of Morgan County, and he's got a painting hanging in the Ohio State Capitol building in Columbus, the signing of the Greenville Treaty, and he's got the signing of the Constitution hanging in the U.S. Capitol. You saw it in your American history books in school from Appalachian, Ohio. Leslie Cope, I saw one of his things out here. There's so much rich art and culture that comes out of this region. Of course, Alan Cottrell's, he's still making history with his art. How about Maya Lin? You guys familiar with Maya Lin? She was an Asian American who grew up in Athens, Ohio, and at 18 years of age, she designed probably one of the most visited memorials in the world, the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C., 18 years old, out of Appalachian, Ohio. So what I can say is Appalachian, Ohio history is American history. And in some cases, it's world history. Let me tell you one other guy. Forgot about him. A guy named George Ritchie. You never heard of him probably. How many have ever heard of Tupper's Plains in Meigs County? It's a crossroads. There's not a whole lot there anymore today. This guy was born on New Year's Eve in 1864. And his family had a furniture making business, so he learned to measure twice and cut once. He learned all that kind of discipline then. Went to school in Meigs County, and then he went to the University of Cincinnati. And when he was over there, he was studying engineering, but he slipped over to the observatory there, and he was using the oldest telescope in the world. And he was learning how to take photographs with it. Well, after he got out of Cincinnati, he went to Chicago, and he was teaching manual arts to boys there. And he would get up to the Yerkes Observatory, which had the biggest telescope in the world. It had a 40-inch lens on the end of it. Nobody's ever made a lens bigger than 40 inches. The mass of glass is so great it warps under its own weight. So he was using this to take astrophotographs of not only craters on the moon, but galaxies and star clusters and things that nobody had ever seen at that stage of the game. We grew up with them. These were amazing. People just saw little fuzzy, blurry spots. This guy got the best stuff. And one of the guys he met up there was George Ellery Hale, who was the one who raised the money to build that observatory. Now he wants to build the biggest telescope in the world, bigger than a 40-inch. So now they have to go to mirrors, because you make mirrors bigger. And he hires this guy from Meigs County to design the telescope and make the mirror, which is high, complex geometry and amazing stuff. And it took him forever to get this mirror done. Didn't have to be as good as it was to look through it and see great things, but he wanted to be able to take photographs with it. And if you leave the shutter, the longer you leave a shutter open, if there's a fine flaw in the glass, it gets exaggerated more and more as you leave the shutter open, and he didn't want that. So it started a personality conflict between him and the guy that hired him, but they got it up, and it was the biggest telescope in the world, 60-inch diameter on it for Mount Wilson in California. Now he wants to build the 100-inch, and he hires this guy to make the 100-inch mirror. It takes forever because he's doing the same thing again. They get it up, and it's the biggest telescope in the world, and it's the telescope that Edwin Hubble was using in 1929 when he discovered that the universe was expanding. Prior to that, nobody knew there was anything beyond the Milky Way. Everything we saw we thought was close up. Edwin Hubble, with the guy's telescope from Meigs County, discovered that there was more stuff out there, and it was all moving away from us, that the universe was growing and expanding. That was a paradigm shift change for the human species, thanks to the tool made by this guy from Tupper's Plains. So then Hale wants to build the 200-inch telescope. When I was a kid, that was the biggest telescope in the world, the 200-inch Hale telescope out of Mount Palomar, and the guy from Meigs couldn't get in on it. So he connects up with a French astronomer, and he designs a whole new type of telescope. It's much shorter, and he makes one for the United States Naval Observatory, which they put up in Washington, D.C. They use it. It's really good. but it's not until after he dies. He dies in 1945, and they move that telescope out to Flagstaff, Arizona, and all of a sudden, it's doing 10 times the work that it did in Washington with all the lights and pollution and fog. And so, George Ritchie doesn't know this, but almost every major telescope on all the mountaintops around the world, Kitt Peak in Arizona, Mauna Kea in Hawaii, Peru, Chile, the Canary Islands, everywhere, Greece, they're all using the telescope he designed. He changed the way astronomers look at the night sky. It's also been incorporated into the Hubble Space Telescope. The guy from Tupper's Plains. And nobody in Tupper's Plains knows this, or even in Meigs County. How many of you guys knew this? All of you people from Appalachian, Ohio don't know about this fella, but you all wanted to know about him, didn't you? You just didn't know you wanted to know about him. So now it's our job to share this rich, rich culture and information with other people. I was asked to comment on art and culture's role in building community resiliency in the region. How do our forebears' experiences impact the region we see and live in today? How do we build on their legacies? Well, I'm going to start by quoting the Ohio State House Commissioners from 1838. They said this: "The degree of civilization and knowledge prevailing in a community is always clearly designated by its works of art, and by none more than by its architecture." So they're saying it's our buildings, and that's the thing we see every day. And if you look at the old buildings of Ohio, you can hardly find one that isn't some expression of artistic creation. And we don't treat them like they are the valuable treasures that they are. Let me quote John Ruskin. Anybody familiar with that name? He was a British philosopher, writer, and critic in the late 1800s. He said this: "When we build, let us think that we build forever. Let it not be for present delight nor for present use alone. Let it be such work as our descendants will thank us for. And let us think, as we lay stone upon stone, that a time is to come when those stones will be held sacred because our hands have touched them, and that men will say as they look upon the labor and wrought substance of them and say, 'See, this our fathers did for us.'" Well, I know that my generation inherited one city and one town after another in Ohio that are just those beautiful works of our predecessors, of the immigrants, of our ancestors. And in my lifetime, I've seen us destroy and demolish so many of those, and I've never seen us build one. Think of all the schools you've seen torn down, and public buildings, and things that, you know, think of these old buildings. They're something. As the guy says, in the end, our society will be defined not only by what we create, but what we refuse to destroy. Our history defines us. Our identity as individuals is formed by our biology and our DNA, and also by our association with family and friends, cousins, etc., but also by our relation to our environment, by our built environment, the old buildings and the large trees that we grow up around. And when we lose any one of those things that were part of our existence, we lose a part of ourselves. Think about it. You've all had this experience. You come home from school and that big tree that was in the neighbor's yard is gone, and you miss it. And buildings, and they go by one, so it doesn't seem like we're just wiping our towns out, but they add up. And so, you know, the more we learn about a person or a place or an old building, the more important it becomes. So it's important we learn about these places. If it's just an old building, it's just an old building. But if you find out more stuff about it, it becomes more important. The old structures are the cultural baggage of our ancestors. These old buildings tell us about our forebears, as well as about the landscape of early Ohio. The materials that it was made from came from the landscape right nearby. The wood in the old buildings is from the primeval forests of Ohio. The primeval forests aren't gone. They're holding up the roofs of barns and factories and mills and houses. 2x4s in those buildings are 2 inches by 4 inches. You can't find one of those in a lumber store today. The stone in the foundations of these buildings was cut from Ohio's bedrock. Nobody will ever build buildings like that again. It's important that we preserve what we've got. We need to find ways to repurpose these things and make them the green buildings of the future, because the buildings that we're building today have an average life expectancy of between 35 and 65 years. That's not a great legacy to leave behind. We should think about that, because we inherited a lot. The buildings that we inherited, the barns and the buildings, they were built to last 1,000 years. The guys who built them could never imagine that when the roof leaked, somebody wouldn't fix it. They also could not have imagined that agriculture would evolve so rapidly in a couple generations that the barns they built were obsolete for the farming techniques like giant tractors and round bales. These old barns, they weren't even built for square bales. Every old barn you see in Ohio is built for loose hay. So think about it. And they're not gonna build them again. Who loves barns? Everybody loves barns. Who wants to pay to fix them? It takes a craftsman to fix a barn. You can't just send contractors in there because they have different ways about it. It takes a craftsman. That's who they were built by, and that's what it's going to take. But there's opportunities to train trades and art and skills to people preserving our heritage. We need to keep these old buildings tightened up and mothballed. Even if we don't have a use for them now, we need to just mothball them. If we're not creative enough now to figure out it, then let's mothball it. It costs millions to tear these things down anyway. It's amazing how there's always money for demolition. You see it in your own communities, I know it. So anyway, old buildings, they tell us so much. We had a fellow came down from Columbus and toured through the Athens Asylum with us. He says, this was a green building of its era. We have so much to learn from this building. That's from an architect who's restored buildings all over Ohio, including he was the one in charge of restoring the Ohio State House. I hope you've been there. One of the most amazing buildings in Ohio. In a time of global climate change, resource conservation is critical. And if it's important to reuse old paper and cans and bottles, think how important it is to reuse old buildings. Historic preservation is sustainability on steroids. Repurposing these old buildings is such a great opportunity to learn and to educate. And my fear is that as we improve the education of students in Appalachia, they'll leave. It's important we keep these towns and cities and neighborhoods exciting and interesting. And what is it that does that? It's their heritage. It's not any of the new stuff we're building. Everybody's got a Dollar General and a Walmart and a Taco Bell. That doesn't make you stay because you can go someplace else and find it. What makes you stay is the rich heritage that's there. And part of it's the buildings. If they're gone, why stay? It's not an exciting place. So I wanted to share a few ideas about, and some good stuff has happened. And I have to say, like somebody mentioned Passion Works this morning, the work they're doing in Athens, the Portsmouth murals. How many of you have gotten to see the Portsmouth murals? What an amazing, somebody created some heritage down there worth preserving. How often today do we create heritage worth preserving? Most of it's already, it was here. They're doing good stuff. How many of you have seen the Dickens Christmas in Cambridge around the holidays? Go between Thanksgiving and Christmas, visit Cambridge. I'm telling you, you'll be so impressed with and it's all done by volunteers. The Mount Zion Baptist Church in Athens, people are trying to save that black history there. The theater in Logan, they're trying to restore an old theater. And you walk in there and you go, wow, this is so big and so overwhelming. Why bother? Well, it's going to cost millions. Guess what? Costs millions to tear it down, costs millions to put up something else in its place, and the thing you get won't be as good and it won't last as long. So it's worth spending that money. We've heard for years it's cheaper to tear it down and start over. No, it ain't. It never was. Never was, so don't accept that argument. Okay, let me just share a few things that I think are critical. Knowing our history is important to our identity. History nurtures personal and collective identity in a diverse world. People discover their place and time in time through the discovery of stories, families, and a nation. These stories of freedom, equality, injustice, struggle, loss, and achievement, courage and triumph all shape people's personal lives and help guide them through life. Knowing history is important for critical thinking. History teaches vital skills. Historical thinking requires critical approaches to evidence and argument and develops contextual understanding and historical perspective, encouraging meaningful engagement with concepts like continuity, change, causation, and the ability to interpret and communicate complex ideas clearly and coherently. Preserving and incorporating our history as part of our future is important for our communities. History is the foundation for strong, vibrant communities. A place becomes a community when wrapped in human memory, as told through family stories, tribal traditions, civic commemorations, as well as discussions about our roles and responsibilities to each other and the places we call home, our sense of place. Historic buildings are community assets and society's wealth. Buildings connect members of the community over time. Historic buildings hold that connection forever, as long as they stand. They are part of the common memory and experience of the community and help form the identity of all who live and work there. I think of the towns that lost their schools. The school where they might have gone to different churches, but they all went to the same school. It was a connection for all of them, and then the school's gone. And the town goes with it in many cases. I know a couple of towns where the school was the central thing that held it together. And when they finally got that school building off the line and consolidated, the town went with it. It's tragic. History is important to for economic improvement. History is a catalyst for economic growth. Communities with cultural heritage institutions and parks and a strong sense of historical character attract talent. They increase tourism revenues, but I don't think that's the main reason we ought to be preserving our heritage for somebody else. We should preserve it for the people who live there. It enhances business development and fortifies local economies. Making history a part of a future is good for business, good for family, and good for community development. It's important to engage citizens in history. History helps people envision a better future. Democracy thrives when individuals convene to express opinions and take action. Weaving history into discussions about contemporary issues clarifies differing perspectives, misconceptions, misperceptions. It reveals complexities, grounds competing views in evidence, and it introduces new ideas. All can lead to a greater understanding and viable community solutions. And knowing history is important for leadership. History inspires leaders. History provides today's leaders with role models as they navigate through the complexities of modern life. The stories of persons from the past can offer direction to contemporary leaders and help clarify their values and ideals. And our history, our past and tomorrow's history, should be a part of our legacy. History saved and history preserved is the foundation for future generations. Historical knowledge is crucial to protecting democracy. By preserving authentic, meaningful documents, artifacts, images, stories, places, buildings, future generations have a foundation on which to build and know what it means to be a member of the civic community. Preservation of our histories and the reinforcement of the models of behavior that create our valued heritage gives future citizens a grounding on what it means to be an American. Think about that. Where would we be? We've lost so many important buildings. And we can't just preserve a couple, not in my opinion. Oh, we've got to save Independence Hall in Philadelphia and, the U.S. Capitol building if we can in Washington. No. If they're just single things, it's like protecting our communities down here in Southeast Ohio. Can't just shine up this one over here and this one over here and then travel between communities in decay. It needs to be like a necklace, you know, a string of pearls. We raise them all up together. So we enjoy going through all these communities instead of saying, can't wait to get to this other one. Boy, these places are hurting. We need to work together on that. The Southeast Ohio History Center, we're reaching out to our neighbors. You know, we didn't realize this till we became the Southeast Ohio History. We all have a common heritage down here. You know, from the Ohio River all the way to the Scioto River was Washington County at one time, and it reached halfway up to Cleveland. When Ohio became a state, Athens County didn't even exist. Southeast Ohio was Washington County, Fairfield, Ross, and Gallia. And in subsequent years, they hacked into each of those counties to make Hocking, Perry, Morgan, Meigs, Jackson, Lawrence, finally Vinton County, and Noble County, the last one on the shelf. But we all have that common heritage, you know, and all these towns and places were hooked by roads when they started because they all needed each other to survive in this new world. Well, you know, now we got these county lines and they're like national borders, aren't they? Who in Athens is paying attention to what's going on in Logan or Pomeroy or MacArthur and vice versa? We're all caught up in our own thing, but we really should be working together like you're doing here today. This is a great thing to come together and start sharing, because the stories reach across county lines. If you'd have died in Vinton County in 1845, Vinton County didn't exist. Your death records are in some other genealogical center in some other county. Could be in one of 3 or 4 different counties at the time. So working together is an opportunity to do better work. We need to be finding ways to fund heritage and art preservation and job creation in doing that. Think of the jobs that could be created and trained on to fix the old stuff. That's high quality work. That's good work. And, you know, visitors bureaus have figured out a way to fund themselves through bed taxes or something. And they're happy to bring people here and show them your heritage sites. But how do we protect the heritage sites? Nobody has a budget for them. And everything costs millions of dollars. So it's a great way to grow our economy. Let's put millions and millions of dollars into saving our best stuff and enhancing it and make it the centerpiece. Polish it up, put it to work again. Preservation of our rich heritage and of old buildings should not be a battle. These should be celebrations. We're all excited to save these places because they're important. They help define us.